Okie dokie. Next up, we have our lesson on R selected and K selected species. Hopefully, by the end of this lesson, you will understand this meme and why you might want to feel kind of bad for the R selected offspring. Okay, so R selection and K selection, sometimes called R strategists and K strategists, are reproductive strategies that organisms can have to try to allow them to adapt to their environment. So there are two major types. K-selected species tend to reproduce fairly slowly. The K, in case you're wondering, comes from the German word for carrying capacity because K-selected species populations don't tend to really grow beyond the carrying capacity. And don't worry, we've got an upcoming lesson that will talk about carrying capacity if you don't remember what that is. R selected species, on the other hand, tend to reproduce rapidly, and that's how I remember the difference between them. The R in R selected, I think of as standing for rapid, and that's rapid growth. So let's talk about each of these. K selected species tend to be larger bodied, they'll have fewer offspring per reproduction event. And when I say fewer, you may think, oh, maybe one offspring at a time. But no, even some organisms that have two, three, five, 10 offspring at a time can be considered K strategists, especially if they meet some of these other characteristics. They tend to live in stable environments where there's a lot of competition for resources. And so a lot of K strategists may be specialists, but that's not a hard and fast rule. So don't think, oh, if it's a case strategist, it has to be a specialist. That's not necessarily the case. For example, humans are case strategists because we meet a lot of these characteristics. We're basically generalists. We can survive in a lot of different environmental conditions. One of the major characteristics of case strategists is they spend a lot of energy taking care of each of their offspring. So they will care for each offspring and put a lot of effort and energy into making sure they survive to adulthood. A lot of times, this means that they'll have an extended childhood. It may take them longer to mature to adulthood, and they'll have a lot of parental care. Humans are a very extreme example of this in that, we take care of our offspring for a good 18 years. But even if you think beyond the legal sense of things, we have to take care of our offspring pretty extensively for the first couple of years of their life. You can't just release a baby into the wild. They won't survive without a lot of parental care, and they tend to have long lifespans or a high life expectancy. They also reproduce more than once in their lifetime. So, humans, for example, can have multiple babies over the course of their life. So, what case strategists tend to favor is quality over quantity. And an example of this would be, for example, an elephant. Elephants are pregnant for close to 2 years. They usually have one or two offspring at a time. And they spend a lot of time and effort and energy making sure that each of their relatively few offspring survive to adulthood. So they're going for quality over quantity. That's going to be different from the R selected species. They have a lot of characteristics that are the opposite of the K selected species. So they'll tend to have smaller bodies. They'll have many offspring. And when I say many offspring, I don't mean like 10 or 20. Some of these organisms can have tens of thousands of offspring at the same time. They do not spend a lot of time or energy caring for their offspring, so they don't really take care of them. These offspring tend to mature early. They're able to kind of survive on their own fairly quickly, which is good because they're not getting a lot of care from their parents. They have shorter lifespans, and a lot of these guys will reproduce only once in their lifetime, and they will just have like a reproductive explosion. They'll reproduce, have a ton of offspring. A lot of these organisms will lay eggs, for example, and then soon after they reproduce, they'll die. And they also live in habitats where there's not a ton of competition for resources. And so they are also often generalists. Not always, but a lot of times they are generalists. So they go for quantity over quality. I'm going to have as many offspring as I possibly can, and hopefully one or two of them will survive to adulthood. Here is an example. So this, it's kind of hard to see because it was hard to find a good picture, is an octopus. This is an octopus mom with let's see, this species of octopus, if I remember correctly, can lay up to like 56,000 eggs at once. And this octopus mom will um, it is a little weird. They're not quite our strategists. They do produce a lot of offspring. Once those offspring hatch, they don't provide care for them because unfortunately, the a lot of octopus species, the mothers will take care of their eggs. Once the eggs hatch, they tend to die because they don't tend to leave to eat anything. So they kind of starve to death over the course of their care of their offspring. But out of these 56,000 or so octopuses or octopi, sorry, forget about what the plural of octopus is. But a lot of these babies will not survive. In fact, on average, for every brood of babies that an octopus raises, you'll have 2 to 3 that will survive to adulthood. So they are producing a massive quantity of offspring in the hope that a few of them will have whatever characteristics are needed to let them survive to adulthood in this environment. Now, reproductive strategies aren't an absolute. This is another one of those examples of humans trying to classify things and kind of enforcing these arbitrary sorts of categories that don't actually exist in nature. So, most organisms aren't exactly R strategists or K strategists. They might have some characteristics of one or the other. So, for example, trees have a lot of traits that K strategists have. Trees, they tend to live for a very long time. Some of them can live for hundreds. Um, there's, I think, an example of or two of a species of tree that can live to over 1,000 years. They're very high. They live in competitive environments, but they also have some characteristics of our strategists. So they will produce thousands of offspring, and those will be dispersed widely, and they don't care for those offspring. Not really beyond the seed point. Sea turtles also have characteristics of both K and arch strategists. They are large organisms and they have long lifespans. But they tend to produce large numbers of offspring. And if you've ever seen videos or read descriptions of sea turtles hatching on a beach, their moms aren't there. Their moms aren't guarding the eggs or anything like that. They lay the eggs and the moms go back to sea, and then the sea turtles hatch. And if they make it, they make it. If they don't, they don't. So here you see an image of kind of a spectrum of organisms between R and K selection. Oysters, for example, are extreme R selected species. They're letting loose about 500 million offspring a year. They'll lay eggs and sperm in the water. Fish, this tuna, for example, is an organism that will release thousands of offspring a year, but tuna are also a little longer lived. Then you have the other end of the spectrum. A chimpanzee, for example, is an extreme K strategist. It will have one offspring every 5 years, and it will take a lot of care of that offspring to try and make sure it lives to maturity. Close to that spectrum, you have large cats like a puma that will have two offspring in a year. Now, there are some cases where species can actually switch between one reproductive strategy and another depending on the environment that they're in. And I searched for quite a bit and I only could find this one really clear cut example. And it's a biofilm. So, a biofilm is this kind of goopy, gunky kind of collection of bacterial cells that attach to each other and they behave differently from individual bacterial cells. You've actually encountered a biofilm pretty much every morning of your life because if you feel your teeth when you wake up, that kind of film that's on the surface that feels a little gooey, that's a biofilm of bacteria growing on the surface of your teeth. Hopefully, you brush those away every day. Now, when there aren't a lot of nutrients in an area, biofilms will be very large, kind of like a case strategist. They grow slowly and they'll reproduce not super frequently. They'll reproduce by breaking off these large fragments or chunks of themselves, and these large fragments that break off tend to have a relatively high chance of survival. So they have some characteristics of K selected species, but when the environment changes, when there's a lot of nutrients available, then they'll actually break off a bunch of these smaller individual cells, like what you see here. These individual cells, that is in times of high nutrient availability, and these can all go and kind of seed new biofilms. They're going to reproduce exponentially because a lot of them will be produced at once, but each individual cell has a very low chance of forming a new biofilm, which is something like what an R selected species would do. So, this is an example of an organism, or in some case, a collection of organisms. You can have one species of bacteria living in a biofilm that can change strategies depending on how the environment is changing. And then all of this will feed into an idea of something called biotic potential. That is the maximum rate at which an organism or species can reproduce in ideal conditions. And, you'll have different biotic potentials for case strategists versus R strategists. But the ideal conditions we're talking about are plenty of food, plenty of resources, including habitats, places to live, no predators or very few predators, and no spread of disease. Now, obviously, these are conditions that are very rarely met in nature. So, while there's a biotic potential that you can imagine if everything was hunky dory and perfect in the world for this organism, it's not something it's kind of more of an ideal. It's not something you actually see in nature. And this is determined by the organism's rate of reproduction. So if you think about it, our strategists, which reproduce fairly quickly, have a high biotic potential. Their population can grow very quickly because they can produce a lot of offspring and they don't have to wait a long time before they're able to get sexual maturity and be able to produce offspring of their own. K strategists, on the other hand, or K selected species, reproduce slower, and so they tend to have a lower biotic potential. And all of these factors, the reproductive strategy, the biotic potential of an organism, um, can really affect how a species is going to respond to invasive species, which we talked about in the last lesson. So, case selected species, they're more vulnerable to change because they don't reproduce as quickly. They have a lower biotic potential, which means that they're more likely to be harmed, or in this case, adversely affected. Same difference by invasive species. That's a lot because of their low biotic potential, meaning they can't reproduce as quickly. So a lot of times they'll be outcompeted by an invading R selected species. Most invasive species tend to be R selected because they can move into an environment, reproduce very quickly, and their population can grow out of control. And once again, we'll talk about that more in Unit 9. And that's the end. Here's a random duck for your enjoyment.